the last lecture for chapter 15. I'm going to try to do this pretty quickly so that no one has to listen to it on 1.5 speed, because I'm sure I sound like a crazy chipmunk. All right, so the 1866 elections, like I said in class, Andrew Johnson makes he makes them revolve around the 14th Amendment. He wants voters to elect men to Congress who support him and his policies. And on top of that, he claims that radical Republicans are plotting to assassinate him. I would one day love to think myself of such importance that people want to assassinate me. This, along with some riots in southern cities that targeted Black people, undermined support for the allies of President Johnson, and Republican opponents that were against him emerge victorious in the 1866 elections. Keep in mind, this is the midterm election, not the election for president. So Johnson is still in the term that Abraham Lincoln was supposed to have completed. Every southern state except Tennessee refused to ratify the 14th Amendment. Johnson and the white South resistance pushed moderate Republicans into the radical camp, whereas before, some of them, remember we talked in class, some of them are still kind of like, I don't know, they're not quite as intense on some of the things that Thaddeus Stevens and his allies wanted to do, but now they're like, okay, look, you're crazy. In March 1867, Congress passes the Reconstruction Act. And this is also commonly called the Military Reconstruction Act because in it, it divides the South into 5 military districts and has a military person in charge of each district. And this calls for establishing new state governments. And in these new state governments, it's required that Black men are allowed to vote. This is also called radical Reconstruction, and this is commonly considered to have lasted until 1877. And we'll talk about why it ends in a few minutes. So Congress is at the same time approving a law, a measure that keeps the president from removing office holders, including members of his cabinet, without the Senate's consent. So if you want to think back over the most recent term of President Trump, there were people in his cabinet that would be hired and fired and blah 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 constantly. Like there was a lot of turnover. So traditionally, there's no mechanism in the Constitution that allows for the president's cabinet. If you remember back to Washington, he just kind of knew things that he did not know, and so he found people that did know these things, and he asked them for help. The presidential cabinet is kind of, well, I mean, it started out very informally. So if you are interested in where the term cabinet comes from, it's because like little private rooms that you used to go into with like your close friends or maybe your very close family were called cabinets. And so, yeah, it's a whole big thing. But at this time, the Congress, they know that Johnson's going to violate this. Like it's a setup, the whole point of this. So what they do is they have this law in effect, and Johnson is like, look, you can't do this. He says that it's an unconstitutional limit of the president's authority, and he's kind of right, actually. And he takes Secretary of War Edward M. Stanton, and he removes him from his seat in the cabinet. And because of this, I mean, it's blatantly violating this law. The House approves articles of impeachment. And in doing that, they send the charges against Johnson to the Senate. And again, if you remember back to President Trump's presidency, these articles of impeachment from the House get sent to the Senate, and then the Senate tries the president for high crimes and misdemeanors. Remember too that there's no real definition of what high crimes and misdemeanors means in the Constitution, so it's questionable. This is the first time that a president has faced articles of impeachment. Not all Republicans agreed with this. They kind of recognized the setup that, they had, that these people that were against him had committed. I mean, even as much as I dislike Johnson's presidency, it is a setup. Like there's no question. It's not like they were, suddenly struck with this huge matter of morality. They were just like, yeah, let's see, we can do this, and he will definitely violate it, and we can impeach him. Um, when he gets impeached, Johnson is he kind of he it humbles President Johnson. He indicates that, you know what, okay, look, I'm going to stop messing around with y'all. Don't remove me from office. So they end up voting, and if I am remembering correctly, I believe it is 7 Republican senators who side with the Democrats to make sure that President Johnson is not convicted and then removed from office. But after that point, he is very much useless. I mean, he is without batteries. For some reason, that term keeps moving around in my head. So following this, the Republicans nominate Ulysses S. Grant for president to run against a guy named Horatio Seymour. I'm sure he was very important to the people around him, but I've literally never heard of this man until I read it in your textbook. So, I mean, maybe that reflects more on me than it does on him. He's a Democratic candidate. He was a governor of New York. And obviously, Reconstruction is becoming the issue of these elections. Ulysses S. Grant, I think we can all remember, is our war hero. I don't understand how the Democrats actually thought they had a chance in a warm place with Satan living there for Mr. Seymour to win. But the Republicans end up painting the Democrats as secessionists, as guilty of treason. And this is a tactic that's called waving the bloody shirt, meaning, like we all know it happened, and we're just going to sit there and keep harping on it over and over. Honestly, to me, it feels more like beating a dead horse, but okay. Democrats say that Democrats are saying that Republicans have put in an unconstitutional Reconstruction. And they're also appealing to the racist faction in the country and saying that the giving the vote to Black Americans violates American political traditions. And I mean, yeah, technically, I guess they're right, but there was a war. And so, yeah, okay. This is the 1868 campaign poster. We have for President Ulysses S. Grant. We have for Vice President Henry Wilson. And let's see, it says the Galena Tanner, because Ulysses S. Grant was from Galena. I don't know where Galena is. I want to say Illinois, but for some reason I feel like that's wrong. Anyway, you can look it up. It's fine. And Henry Wilson, the Natick Shoemaker. And I believe that Natick is in Rhode Island. He is, he's shown as like the ordinary working man to try to appeal to this. Remember, the North right now has the philosophy of free labor, and that's kind of the thing that they're focusing on. Like, people need to be able to market their own labor, blah, blah, blah. And so this is their campaign. These are our Democratic tickets. Our motto is, this is a white man's country. Let white men rule. So they didn't hide that at all. Horatio Seymour and a running mate with the last name of Blair. And in my notes here, I don't even have Mr. Blair's first name. So super, super important. Okay, so Grant wins, and it says by a slim margin. Republicans respond in February of 1869 by adopting the third and final Reconstruction Amendment, which was the 15th Amendment, which bars federal and state governments from denying the right to vote to any citizen based on race. So the way that I remember 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, because I always, my ridiculous brain with numbers. The 13th Amendment outlaws slavery. The 14th Amendment gives citizenship, birthright citizenship, and equal protection, and you have to no longer be enslaved to become a citizen. And then the 15th is voting. because you have to be a citizen before you can vote. It may be stupid and you may have a better way to remember it, but that's how it works in my little crazy messed up brain. Okay. The Democrats, of course, are against it, but the 15th Amendment is ratified in 1870. It enables states to make voting restrictions not based on race, such as literacy tests, property requirements, poll taxes, and it does not give the right to vote to women, but it does represent like the ultimate ending to abolition. These these tests or restrictions that are not outlawed in the 15th Amendment will come into play later when the South is able to restrict, or they're trying to restrict voting from African Americans. Our Reconstruction laws and amendments reflect the power of the new national government and this idea that citizens should enjoy legal equality. One Republican says there's a great constitutional revolution that transforms the federal system and the language of American freedom. Keep in mind, we have been talking about what is freedom, what is American freedom, how does that philosophy or idea change over time. Before the Civil War, citizenship had been restricted to race, but Reconstruction laws reject this notion that citizenship is reserved only for whites. They guarantee legal equality, and this affects discriminatory laws in all states, both North and South. So the North, keep in mind, it's not like the North was a shining beacon of freedom. They were freer in relation to what the South was offering. So that's not much. If the North had racist laws put in place, then those laws were no longer able to be enforced because of this legal equality. Our new amendments change the relationship between the states and the federal government. The Bill of Rights assumes that the central government is a threat to liberty, but Reconstruction assumes that only the national government can protect liberty or individual rights. That is a very fine distinction, but it's a very important distinction. This is a shift. So originally, the founding fathers were very distrustful of a strong national government, and now our political leaders are distrustful of not having a strong federal government that is able to kind of be the policeman or the watchdog of what the states are doing, because they saw what happened if you left the states up to their own devices. These people make the federal government now is making the Constitution an instrument where vulnerable minorities can make claims for freedom against government misconduct at all levels. Many important 20th century Supreme Court decisions are based on the 14th Amendment. One example of this is the Brown versus Des Moines, Board of Education of Des Moines, Iowa, in 1954. So this citizenship question, what is a citizen, what is equal protection under the law, it gives rise to certain things called protected classes, and it allows for the federal government to step in and say, you know what, no, this group of people are, they're being targeted, they're not being treated fairly, so we're going to have to fix that. As you can see, this is our electing map, our elector map in 1868. Our Republican candidate, keep in mind that was Ulysses S Grant, and he gets these. And then Southern Democrat, Seymour. I mean, I don't know. It says that Grant won by a small margin, and if you go by popular vote, yes, he only won with 53% of the vote. But if you go to the elector vote, it's 73%. And if we have paid attention to anything in the past few years involved in electing, it's those electoral votes that matter. It doesn't, who cares about the popular vote? At the end of the day, it's the electors that choose the president, and there we are. This is an engraving from Thomas Nast. He's a very famous artist at the time. It's called Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving Dinner, and it depicts the boundaries of freedom expanding during Reconstruction. We can look at it closer, but as you can see, we have many different nationalities, women, babies even. Well, babies matter. Some fat dude in there. Everyone is now covered by the Constitution, except for men. Yay! Okay. Reconstruction, like we were just saying, it makes the boundaries of freedom different. So, what does that mean for women? Exclusions that limit citizenship and privileges to white men had long defined American democratic practice. Even Republicans who are committed to universal rights don't want to extend these rights to all races because that would be a bridge too far. Um, some Republicans, like a dude named Anson Burlingame, that's nice, Frederick Douglass and Charles Sumner, want to end discrimination against Asians in the nation's immigration laws and treaties. So in 1870, Sumner tries to strike the word white from naturalization requirements. Um, Western state senators made Africans eligible for naturalization, but barred Asians from becoming naturalized citizens. Up until the 20th century, Asian immigrants still are not allowed to become citizens, while American-born children are citizens automatically. So this raises a problem. Our birthright citizenship. This is kind of a big issue, I don't want to say issue, but big subsection that people are kind of researching and arguing about, which is birthright citizenship. Why did they choose birthright citizenship? And I would posit that the reason why they did that is because they had no other good rule. I mean, you have a lot of people who have been enslaved. Most, if not all of them, have been born in this country. And I say most, if not all, because as the international slave trade is abolished in 1808, that does not mean that we didn't have people snuck into the country as enslaved peoples. The last slave trade in the last slave ship in Mobile, I can't remember when it was. I'm gonna look it up real quick. Last slave ship in Mobile. 1860. So there we are. And that's the last one that they found. But yeah, this is a big thing that scholars are looking at right now is like, how did this affect populations for whom naturalization was not available? Women's rights advocates are discovering that there are limits to this Republican push for equality. Um, They see the expansion of federal power and rights as a chance to advance women's equality along with the equality of African Americans. But their demands, especially for voting rights, so suffrage, they find little support among male politicians. Shocking. Even among radical Republicans who are only looking at Reconstruction as something to benefit Black men. The 14th and 15th Amendments specifically benefit men, not women, as duh. And this is this causes like a wedge to be driven between the feminists and radical Republicans. I'm still saying it, y'all. I cannot believe it. Okay. So some people like Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they oppose the 15th Amendment. So go a little bit off the rails there. Mainly because it does not enfranchise women. So it's not that, well, actually, no, there is a quote in your textbook that's like super racist. So I'm going to skip that thought that I just had. Other abolitionist feminists, such as a woman named Abby Kelly and another one named Lucy Stone, argue that the Reconstruction Amendments, while limited, are advances towards universal suffrage and should be supported. So, you still had some that were kind of like going, no, look, like we got to be rational here. These two sides split into two groups. The National Women's Suffrage Association, representing Stanton and Anthony, and then the American Women's Suffrage Association, representing Stone and Kelly. One area where women's political rights did expand during Reconstruction was in Wyoming. Yay! They extend suffrage rights to women in 1869 to try to attract women immigrants because there were like no women there. And the dudes were like, look, we gotta have some ladies here. Um, so, despite drawing the boundaries of freedom at gender, Reconstruction marks the only society in the world in which emancipation is followed by the extension of citizenship rights to those who had been formerly enslaved. So, uh, I'm not even going to go out on a limb and say yay. Like, to me, it's like great, yes, citizenship on paper, but at the end of the day, there are still thousands of the formerly enslaved that are being discriminated against and exploited. So don't just give lip service to how equal everyone is now. This is an engraving. It includes Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, although I promise you, neither of those ladies looked as like nice and put together and lovely as these women. They were, along with all of the people. I mean, they didn't have sunscreen, so like the skin was rough. All right, so here is our next focus question: Radical Reconstruction in the South. What were the social and political effects of radical Reconstruction in the South? All right, the Reconstruction Act sparks a great amount of political activity among the formerly enslaved in the South. They hold mass meetings, they go on strike for higher wages, they do sit ins to integrate public transportation. Thousands of Southern Blacks joined something called the Union League, and it is an organization that was tied to the Republican Party. And the vast majority of eligible Black voters register to vote. In the words of one former slave turned political leader, the Blacks had heard the tocsin of freedom. I'm going to look this up because while it sounds like toxin, I'm not really sure what that means. And I guess I should have looked it up. Oh, okay. It means an alarm, bell, or signal from Old French. All right, well, we don't use that word anymore, so cool. By 1870, all former Confederate states have been readmitted to the Union, and most are under Republican control. There are new state constitutions that were drafted in 68 and 69 in like constitutional conventions that had large Black representation there. Definitely an improvement over their old state constitutions. They create state-funded systems of public education, um, penitentiaries, orphan and insane asylums, where none of these things like were around before this. They guarantee equality of civil and political rights. They abolish antebellum practices like whipping as a criminal punishment. They get rid of property qualifications for office holding, and they get rid of debtors' prisons. Though Black people were the majority of Republican voters, white Republicans control the state Republican parties, and they hold most of the political offices. Only in the state of South Carolina, coincidentally enough, the first state that seceded, of course, the state has a large percentage of Black people in their population, and so they have a majority Black legislature. But your textbook says that 2,000 African Americans who held public office in Reconstruction represented a radical shift of power in the South. And let's make a note. 2 Black people were elected to the U.S. Senate, 14 were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and 1 served as the first Black governor in Louisiana. Hiram Revels was the first Black senator coming from the great state of Mississippi. Many Black people serve in the state legislature, and more Blacks than ever hold lower offices like sheriff, tax assessor, policeman. Most of these people were the formerly enslaved. So this social mobility so quickly after abolition and emancipation is outstanding, especially when taken in context of the history of the world. This is a political meeting depicted in the rural South. This is an 1883 lithograph celebrating African American progress and includes many African American politicians. There is Henry Louis Gates, who is a pretty well-renowned African American scholar who studies Reconstruction. He does a pretty he does a really great documentary on Reconstruction and goes into some of these photographs and lithographs and whatnots that are from the time period. This is an engraving that depicts the first biracial elections in Southern history. So the South's new state governments also empower new groups of white people. Some Northerners who migrated to the South after the war were there. These were called carpetbaggers, and it implies that they pack their stuff up in a suitcase to move to the South so that they can take advantage of, the misery of the white people down there. While some were corrupt, as it is in any population, most carpetbaggers were Union Army veterans who decided to stay there after the war. This happens all the time during warfare. You have people that go to serve for the invading army and they're like, I like it here, I'm staying. Others were investors in land and railroad, and they're looking for economic opportunities. And others were teachers, officers from the Freedmen's Bureau, or others who just go south because they want to help the formerly enslaved. Most white Republicans were from the South, and the former Confederates hated them. They saw these men as treasonous scalawags, even though I would like to point out that the Confederates were treasonous, but that's neither here nor there. While some were wealthy whites, most were non-slaveholding small white farmers from the upcountry, so kind of like those hill areas. Many had been Unionists during the war, or they hoped that Reconstruction governments would pass laws favoring farmers who were in debt. The Reconstruction government's greatest accomplishment was establishing state-supported public schools that served both Black and white children, although these were still usually segregated schools. They also passed civil rights laws that made it illegal for railroads, hotels, and other institutions to discriminate by race. Some states strengthened the economic power of rural Blacks by passing laws favoring agriculture workers and sharecroppers. But Reconstruction governments did not try to promote economic prosperity through land distribution, as many Blacks had once hoped, but they to develop railroads. They hope that this is going to spur industrialization, urbanization, and diversified agriculture. So let's get away from the cotton growing South. Maybe let's be a little different. Every southern state tries to finance railroad construction and attract industry through tax and subsidy policies, but this kind of, revitalized, changed southern economy doesn't really come together. Radical Republicans do transform the South by empowering poor whites and northern migrants and former slaves. So it is a measure of how far this change has progressed that the reaction against Reconstruction proves so extreme. So the fact that these people are like the Confederates are so mad, they're so butthurt about Reconstruction, it's because so many inroads have been made for the formerly enslaved people. This is an 1874 through 1875 photograph of the Mississippi Senate shortly before the end of Reconstruction. So if you will see here, we have, this is actually the postmistress. I had to look it up. So she is the postmistress. Here we have our formerly enslaved. I believe that is a Black gentleman too. These must be Black gentlemen. Yeah. Okay, so I think the Black representatives, congressmen start here, yes, and then go here, although that dude is very pale. And she's so pretty, look how pretty she is. Okay. Hiram Revels, first U.S. Black senator, yay, Mississippi, and that was the last time we did anything. Okay. This is an 1865 lithograph depicting Lincoln emancipating slaves and a poor white family suggesting that all of Americans are going to benefit from Reconstruction reforms. And had these reforms actually gone through and people didn't kind of warp things, in my opinion, they would have helped all Americans. This is a group of Black students and their teacher. All right, so here we are. What are the main factors in both the North and the South for the abandonment of Reconstruction? Alrighty. So our South's traditional leadership, planters, merchants, and our Democratic politicians, they say that these new governments that have been put in place are corrupt and they are inefficient examples of Black supremacy, even though there was not a majority representation of Black men. But let's move on from there. Corruption does exist in our Reconstruction governments, like, everywhere. But it wasn't like there was one single race, region, or party. Like, it's just there. The fact that state budgets increase so quickly allows many people to kind of, skim off the top. Corruption is the greatest in the whiskey ring, which involves Grant administration officials. And then you have New York's infamous Tweed ring that's controlled by Democrats. We'll talk about those in a little bit. I believe it's actually the next chapter. Raising these taxes were needed because you had to pay for schools, you had to pay for railroad development, you had to pay for those penitentiaries and those asylums. Like, you had to pay for all of these things. So taxes had to be raised. But because taxes are raised, as we know today, things don't really change. There is opposition here. So everybody's like, yeah, this is great. But then when they're the ones that have to pay for it, they're like, yeah, no, maybe we don't need to have that. Poor whites also, who initially are kind of in favor of these Republicans, because wait, I don't know what I meant there. I left out something. Anyway, they initially support the Republicans, but when their economic situation does not improve like overnight, they go right back to the Democratic Party. I mean, that's just what Americans do. We have a very short attention span. Southern whites oppose Reconstruction because they can't accept that Black people should vote. They don't want them to hold political office. They don't want to have legal equality. They thought that Reconstruction should be overthrown in order for white supremacy to return and planners to have a disciplined and dependable workforce. So as long as it's not me having to do the work, we're good. But, as soon as I have to like do anything, forget that. And again, I don't want to do work either. So, violence is endemic in the Reconstruction South. At first, it starts out as local and unorganized, with Black people being assaulted and murdered for not getting out of the way of white people on sidewalks or trying to purchase land. But when our Republican state governments are established after 1867, this ignites organized campaigns of violence. Our secret societies, like the Ku Klux Klan, yay, they try to prevent Blacks from voting, and they try to destroy the Republican Party by assassinating local leaders and public officials. So they at least, went hard. The KKK is a terrorist organization. It started in Tennessee. It was founded by Nathan Bedford Forrest, and it spreads throughout the South. It operates as the military arm of the Democratic Party in that region. In many counties, it starts a reign of terror against Black and white Republican leaders. But of course, Black people are especially targeted, particularly those who held office or actually, did anything with their newfound political rights. The new Southern governments aren't able to suppress the KKK. One, they don't have the forces because all the people that they would send were in it. And it's a secret society by nature. So while all the people who were supporting them knew who each other was, the people who were against the KKK did not. In 1870 and in 1871, Congress adopts the Enforcement Acts, and these outlaw terrorist groups. It allows the president to use the army against them, And it actually defines acts that deprive citizens of civil and political rights as federal crimes. So now we are giving our federal government the ability to do something about it. President Grant sends federal marshals and troops to suppress the KKK. And by 1872, most areas of the South were relatively peaceful. This marks kind of a regression, or not, I guess not regression, but the KKK kind of fades away for a while, and then it comes right on back in the 20s. This is a political cartoon. The key thing of rapist, blah, 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 not rapist, the key theme of racist opposition in the South. This mistaken belief in the fact that people are pushing a black supremacy, quote unquote, the white man, the bottom rail, whatever. This is a titled "A Perspective Scene in the City of Oaks" from 1868. It sends a warning to the Reverend A.S. Lakin, who had moved from Ohio to become a university president, and Dr. N.B. Cloud, a Southern-born Republican and Alabama's superintendent of public education. The KKK forced both men from their positions. These two men were white. So it's very interesting to see a depiction of lynching with white victims. This is a KKK member. I don't understand why they thought they were intimidating. I guess it's the fear of the unknown, but come on, like that dude comes up to me and I think I would just laugh at him and be like, really? Have you seen yourself? Sure. Okay, so Northern commitment to Reconstruction declines in the 1870s. Thaddeus Stevens dies, so there's that. Otherwise, many of them have left politics. They're aging, and they are replaced by people that are less dedicated to equal rights for blacks. Americans have short attention spans. Northerners are starting to feel more and more that the South needs to solve its own problems and doesn't need to have the federal government, alternately holding their hand and then taking them out behind the woodshed and smacking them. Many of the North believe that now that the national government has freed slaves, made them citizens, and given them the vote, that black people have to depend on themselves. Like, hey, go for it. I am not a supporter of this kind of philosophy. Like, you don't just throw someone out in the deep end and say, okay, hope you don't drown. You make sure they know how to swim first, I guess. No one asked me because I wasn't alive then. In 1872, an influential group of Republicans are angered by the corruption in the Grant administration, and it is widely held by historians as one of the most corrupt administrations in the history of the American public. They believe that federal power is needed to be reduced. So they form their own party and they call themselves the Liberal Republicans. They nominate Horace Greeley, who is editor of the New York Tribune. He is nominated for president. They repeat Democratic criticisms of radical Reconstruction because they say it encourages corruption and prevents the rule of the best men, like I guess the best people best qualified for the job in the South, and that region's, quote, natural leaders, unquote, although I would hesitate to point out. In fact, I would probably have said it very loudly and obnoxiously, and then they would have told me to go back to my sewing or something. That the natural leaders were so natural in their leadership that they started a rebellion against their own government. Okay. Democratic leaders embrace this Republican split, and they're like, yeah, we're going to do this. And they endorse Greeley. Many of your kind of traditional Democrats don't like Greeley. He is formerly a Whig and a Republican. And Grant ends up winning a second term to the presidency by an overwhelming amount. However, our liberal Republicans and the Democrats in the North are now agreeing on rolling back Reconstruction. So they're like, all right, we've been doing this for a while. Let's bring it to an end. Northern critics step up usually openly racist attacks on Southern governments because they say that it is a den of corruption and misgovernment, and it is ruined by black rule. An economic depression also begins in 1873. And this distracts Northern Republicans from our Southern issues because their own constituents are going, look, we are poor now, we aren't able to eat, like, fix it. Now, economic downturns are pretty traditional after wartime. Um, Obviously, a huge exception to that is post-World War II, where we have our, 1950s culture, but that's a whole other thing. Democrats are successful in the 1874 elections, and they take control of the House of Representatives. But before this new Congress is able to meet, the outgoing legislators, pass the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and this bars racial discrimination in public accommodations, such as hotels and theaters. So no segregation. The Supreme Court also signals a retreat from Reconstruction in what are called the slaughterhouse cases. These are cases from 1873. It's held that the federal government cannot effectively protect the legal and civil rights of individuals in states, and this just, this completely takes the teeth out of the 14th Amendment. 3 years later, the Supreme Court, guts the Enforcement Acts by throwing out the convictions of some of those responsible for the Colfax Massacre of 1873. So this is Reconstruction in the South. Oh, sure. This is a Currier and Ives lithograph from 1872, and it illustrates how nostalgic images of slavery are promoted even as Reconstruction takes place. So look at how happy these people were, and look at how well fed and well dressed and well housed, and it's fantastic. I'm sure if you asked those very people, they would have something else to say, but let's not get the truth. Okay, these two images illustrate changes in the depictions of Black people in graphic art from Thomas Nast. The first image is completed in 1865, and this shows an upstanding citizen. As you can see, he is missing a leg. It's implied that he has fought for the Union and he's fought for freedom. And in the second illustration from 1874, so about a decade later, this suggests that our Reconstruction governments are unruly because now they have Black representatives. This is a bank book that was issued by the Freedmen Saving and Trust Company. Freedmen across the South are depositing nearly $2 million in bank branches. This bank fails in 1874 because of mismanagement, and thousands of depositors lose their savings. So there is a tradition amongst many people in rural areas of the South. And I mean, I'm going to say this goes for white people along with Black people. They don't trust banks. Like, banks fail all the time because at this point we do not have the FDIC, which protects investments that you put in banks, money that you put in banks. So if the bank fails, you're out of your money. And for many, many, many years, a lot of people in rural areas did not use banks. They just kept their money in their home. So by the mid-1870s, Reconstruction is under serious assault. Democrats are regaining control of states with large voting majorities like Tennessee, North Carolina, Texas. They call themselves the Redeemers because they have redeemed the white South from corruption, misgovernment, and Northern and Black control. Violence is flaring in states where Reconstruction governments are still in place, and the Grant administration now doesn't really protect the governments and the Republicans there. In 1875 and 1876, armed Democrats on election day just destroy the ballots, and they drive Black people away from the polls. And this is how they come to a majority in Mississippi and South Carolina. So events in South Carolina directly shape the outcome of the 1867 presidential elections. Republicans nominate Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, who runs against the Democrats' Samuel J. Tilden, New York's governor. By 1876, only North start that sentence all the way over. By 1876, only South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana are still controlled by Republicans. And the election is so close that whoever carries these states, which both sides claim to have won, they're going to become president. Like, that's just, that happens even in modern day elections. Whoever says, whoever wins certain states, they're going to win. Congress tries to resolve this by appointing an electoral commission, which has a Republican majority, and shockingly, they decide that Hayes carries these southern states and has been elected. But to secure this result and to make sure that, people don't cry foul, behind the scenes, Republicans negotiate with Democrats, and they agree to recognize Democratic control in the South and refrain from future federal interference in Southern affairs. Democrats promise, I promise, to respect Black rights and not dispute Hayes's right to office. This becomes known as the Bargain of 1877. There's another name for it, and I cannot remember what it is. Hayes orders federal troops to stand down, which allows Democrats in Louisiana and South Carolina to occupy the state governments. Significantly, the triumphant Southern Democrats failed to live up to their pledge to recognize Blacks as equal citizens. Shocked. Everyone was. Shocked. All right, here is our electoral map. This, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. It was a political cartoon featured in Harper's Weekly, and it comments on the campaign of terror launched by South Carolinian Democrats. This is Thomas Nast again. It illustrates, obviously, that the United States is not either prepared for or will not live up to its democratic ideals. All right, the end of Reconstruction. Reconstruction, if you define it as Americans' adjustment to the end of slavery, continues after 1877. I paused because I was going to say that this is when many Reconstruction scholars will mark as the end of Reconstruction, and that is when this bargain is made and Rutherford B. Hayes is elected president. But Blacks are still voting, and in some states even hold office into the 1890s. But the period when Republicans control much of the South, Blacks held some political power, and federal government is protecting basic rights of all American citizens, does come to an end in 1877. Only a century later, roughly, during the civil rights era of the 1950s and 1960s, would the federal government actually act to secure the rights of all, regardless of race. And as we know, having grown up with the narrative of civil rights behind us, we know it's not always easily won, and it's took much violence and heavy resistance, which some people are still resisting to this day, to actually get this. Reconstruction does reveal some tensions that are inherent in 19th century discussions of freedom. So that's the end. This is our next topic that we're going to move into, which is America's Gilded Age, and this marks the time period from 1870 to 1890.